I would start out by saying that China is not going to become less important anytime soon, I don't think. And if China is going to become more important, then the big question is, how does the world deal with China, and how does China deal with the world? And I think we saw the video about the trade war. That's probably been the best expression of this sort of relationship in the recent past, especially in terms of this sort of American concern about China's rise. And specifically, so my first question is, when does China pass the US in terms of the size of its economy? And when it does, and if it does, is it important? Jean, maybe you could start with that.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here and happy to be on the same panel with you again, John. So the question about when China actually surpasses the US to be the largest economy in the world is a big question mark. Our prediction is that by 2030, the Chinese economy will be about 90% of the size of the US economy. So of course, this depends on a lot of things in the coming, 13 years or 12 years. Basically, it depends on the growth rate differentials between the two countries. It depends on exchange rate movements, US dollar versus RMB. It also depends on the so-called GDP deflator. So if you put all the economic considerations into context, I think in the coming 10 to 12 years, China is going to grow faster than the US. So in the coming 15 years, China could catch up with the US. But putting China in more of a regional and global context, so GDP today for China is 13 trillion US dollars. You look around Asia Pacific, the ASEAN 10 countries add up to about 2.5 trillion. Japan is about 4.5 trillion. And then you can throw in India, which is under 3 trillion, plus Australia, Korea, and other smaller countries around Asia Pacific. They all add up to China, which is $13 trillion. What this means is that China is 50% of Asia Pacific GDP. Right. China also is 17% of global GDP. So the size is enormous. But most importantly, China's contribution to global growth is outsized. What this means is that in the coming several years, China will remain the largest contributor to global growth, accounting for about 35% of global growth. And also, it's not just the size, the pace of growth, it is also the structure of the economy that's changing. China has moved from an agricultural-based economy to manufacturing, and then from manufacturing to services and consumption. And then finally, now, the country has become a hive of innovation from a so-called copycat nation from the past. So all these will have a major influence on global growth and the shift of geo-economic power globally.
Tim, do you think when that date arrives, will it matter? Is it important that it happens in 2031, January 1st?
I think the precise date doesn't matter, but the other side of the question, I think, is to look not just at the size of the economy, but the wealth of the economy in per capita terms. And GDP per capita of the Chinese economy will not surpass that of the US for a long time to come. We're talking generation, possibly longer. I agree with Jing that there's been a big increase in innovation in China over recent years, but you look at some of the other features of the Chinese economy. Research and development intensity, research and development capital stock is still much lower than that of the US. So even when China becomes a big economy, it doesn't necessarily make it the strongest economy in the world, right? I think we need to differentiate between the size and the sort of fundamental strength and the capacity to challenge the US and Western economies, who will still be probably the stronger players in many ways.
So to kind of bring it back to a little bit more present day, we had some news overnight from the Fed, looking like there won't be any interest rate cuts, increases this year. Does that change the outlook at all, Jean?
Well, in the near term, it's very interesting to wake up to the news this morning about the Federal Reserve being dovish, actually turning more dovish even, right? So from earlier on, 4 rate hikes in 2019 to literally no hikes at all in 2019. So of course, the market reacted overnight. The dollar weakened and treasury yields dropped, right? So I think in the near term, this provides some support for China, for the RMB, and for Asian markets in general, because the central bank, the most important central bank in the world, the Fed, is becoming much more accommodative. And secondly, as the dollar weakens, it is always good for emerging market currencies. Right. Last year, we experienced tremendous tightening in financial conditions, especially in the second half globally, because of the strength of the dollar. This year, the dollar has weakened somewhat against other currencies, which really gives some breathing room for the Chinese yuan, right? So we've seen the yuan performing reasonably well in the recent months. And going forward, as the economy stabilizes in China, because just on the back of the National People's Congress last week, we have had a slew of new announcements from the central government, basically announcing policies to support growth, including tax cuts, including further liquidity boosts in the way of RR reductions. Right. And importantly, the Chinese leadership has also indicated strong support for the private sector economy in China and pushing for innovation. I think a combination of a much more accommodative policy stance from the Fed, plus very supportive fiscal, monetary, and exchange rate policies from China will actually help stabilize the Chinese economy. Right. We could see a bottom of the economy sometime mid-year 2019. That's going to be followed by a gentle recovery in the second half of the year.
So dovish Fed, net positive for what the Chinese government is trying to do with the economy, right?
Removing a headwind from global growth.
Of course, of course. Tim, the other headwind is obviously trade, and that's been an expression of sort of how the relationship has become much more competitive between the U.S. and China. Do you see that as sort of a fundamental change, or is that short-term?
No, I think we've seen a fundamental shift in the US-China relationship. I mean, for want of a better phrase, I think we're in a new era, but it's a new era of strategic rivalry. It's not so much about trade. Trade is the sort of immediate manifestation of that. It's about US sort of unease about China's rise. And I think we've seen a pretty broadly bipartisan consensus in the United States that's not a Trump phenomenon, actually. It's something that's been growing for 5, 6 years, maybe longer, that the US needs to take a tougher approach towards China, that China is some sort of strategic rival to the US. And I think that's probably here to stay, whatever happens within the American political cycle. The tactical ways that that's taken forward may differ under a different administration, right? Tariffs may not be the means that other presidents would choose to use. But I think the sort of fundamental perception in Washington that China needs to be treated more toughly is going to be with us for the foreseeable future.
Is there anything China can do to change that trajectory?
I think it's difficult because I think underlying this is a sense of unease about China's rise, and that is going to continue. China's economy is going to continue to grow. China is going to innovate more. There's specific areas. I mean, 5G is the one that's right at the forefront of people's minds, where actually China may well have a company that's at the forefront globally here, and that's something new that the West has sort of not quite worked out how to deal with. China could do some things, I think, in terms of opening up the economy more, allowing market forces to play a stronger role. There's quite a lot of rhetorical support for that in the Chinese government at the moment, but it's probably not going far enough to keep the Americans off their back.
What do you think, Jing? Is this a fundamental change? And if it is a more fundamental change, is that maybe a pretty big long-term headwind for the economy, for China?
Well, I think we have to just accept the fact that US-China competition will continue, and especially in the technological sphere. So this is very different from centuries ago when countries competed for resources, for territory. But the new levers of a modern economy basically are technology, the internet, new payment systems. Basically, everything that's powering a modern economy in the digital age, right? So in this regard, I think competition will become tougher for both countries going forward. Of course, overnight we heard President Trump saying,
yes,
the tariffs on China will remain in place until
right,
such a time China and the U.S. reaches some kind of agreement. So in the shorter term, the tariffs that have been imposed by the U.S. on Chinese exports to America and vice versa will continue to weigh on economic prospects,
right,
because consumers have to pay more. Companies are earning less because of the reduced volumes of exports. So trade friction and increased tariffs are definitely a headwind. But in the longer term, China will not stop innovating.
right.
China's Made in China 2025 plan may have been diplomatically toned down, but the ambitions, the talent are still there. However, I would also say that some talk about an economic Cold War emerging may be overblown. I think there is a great deal of competition. Competition may not be bad because competition makes us all better.
Right.
We just hope the competition between the two countries doesn't change into confrontation.
Right.
So there's a difference between competition and confrontation. When the West looks at China, a rising power, I think the most sensible policy is still engagement, not containment.
Yeah. So you mentioned China 2025. I do want to touch on the other contentious Chinese diplomatic effort, which is Belton Road. But first, I wanted to let everybody know that we do have a poll question. And if you go log on to your phones, the poll question is, when will the Chinese century start? So 1, that's already started. 2, in our lifetime, or 3, beyond our lifetime. So we can, we'll look at the results a little bit later as they come in. So Belton Road, President Xi is in Europe this week, Tim. He's going to be in Italy, I think, our daytime tomorrow. It looks like Italy is going to be the first G7 economy, G7 country to sign up for the Belton Road. How important is that actually?
Well, I think it will be seen, it's being seen as being quite symbolic and important in Europe, that this is a statement which some other European governments saying are uneasy about. And it comes in the context of, a wider debate within Europe about how to deal with China. So just as the US has moved to a more hawkish position, I think the EU has moved in a similar direction, although there's a difference. In Europe, there's a much wider debate within countries and between countries about how to deal with China. There's a much more balanced, I think, picture between China as opportunity and threat. And engagement is a stronger part of the European approach to China than I think it is from the US under the current administration. But this is sort of symbolic of something. I mean, it also says something about European politics. The shifts in governments in countries, they take different approaches towards China, and that's probably going to be a feature of what we're going to see over coming years too.
There's been a lot of criticism, suspicion around Belton Road. Do you see that stopping China's efforts to expand it? Or?
Yeah, I mean, it depends. In a sense, it depends what we mean by Belton Road, right? I think if you see China as a threat to global peace and security, then you tend to interpret Belton Road through that prism. But I mean, you look on the face of it, Belton Road is about infrastructure development. It's about promoting trade and investment. It's about fostering friendship, building ties, and so on. So, I mean, I think if that's the sort of Belton Road that is being delivered, then it's something which other countries should engage with, should sign up to, and it reflects, in a sense, the consensus of 40 years of globalization. That consensus is being challenged now for other reasons. But actually, my view is, this is something which can be net positive for the world.
Sure. Would you agree with that, Jing? Net positive for the world, for China? Well,
if you look at the needs for infrastructure investments along the Belt and Road countries in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, clearly more focus, more support for infrastructure building would be net positive, right? But we want to make sure Belt and Road projects are actually economically and financially viable, but also Belt and Road now has been championed by China, but it really should be a win-win situation for China and also the rest of the Belton Road countries, right? So of course, there's a lot of contention right now as to China's intention of investing so much in the poorer countries in some of these regions. But in general, I think this program will continue in the coming several weeks. There's a major Belton Road summit in Beijing that's happening. Would likely attract many heads of states and business people. So we have to wait and see how this program evolves. I think China is really trying to exert much more global influence now that it is a rising economic power. So it is financial power, it is also soft power. So with Belton Road, it's not just investing in hard infrastructure like airports and bridges and highways, but also China is bringing with its investments a lot of the soft influences that it's trying to exert on the Belton Road regions.
Earlier, you talked a little bit about how the structure of China's economy is changing and how that's affecting the way it interacts with the rest of the world. And, you know, for the last 40 years, China's been a big exporter. It seems like it's moving towards consumption more, and the Chinese consumer is becoming more important. How does that change? How does that change affect the way China deals with it?
There has been a dramatic change in China's economic drivers. So a lot of people focus on the 6.5% growth. They don't focus on where the growth is coming from. So this year, we're forecasting 6.2% growth, right? But most importantly, over 3/4 of the growth, so over 75% of the growth is going to come from personal consumption. And this is really unprecedented. If you compare this against 5 years ago or 10 years ago, right? Personal consumption has become such an important driver of GDP growth that every company, not just in China, but globally, is looking at China as a major source of demand for all kinds of products, services. You know, looking at the luxury goods industry, for example, you know, China from nowhere has become the #1 consumer of luxury products. So if you look at companies that are doing very well in China, of course, Chinese consumers love the heritage, authenticity, the craftsmanship that they see in luxury products. And Chinese consumers have become a huge source of revenue for a lot of global companies as they travel far and wide. 150 million Chinese people will be traveling overseas this year. That compares against the peak in Japan back in the 1980s. 15 million Japanese people traveled overseas. The number from China is 10 times higher. So as consumption becomes a much more important driver for China's growth, I would say the Chinese consumer is becoming a major supporter of the global economy as well, right? And importantly, the consumption is not just about goods. It's increasingly about services such as entertainment, travel, education. So we're seeing the Chinese economy undertaking this major shift from manufacturing to services, from investments to consumption. And that's had really a host of implications for global companies that do business in China.
You talked about some of the successful luxury companies in China. I think it's really interesting to look at some of the unsuccessful ones as well. And I think probably most notable is Dolce & Gabbana. I don't know if you've paid attention to it. What does that situation tell us about how China's position vis-a-vis the rest of the world is changing?
Yeah, well, I watched the ad, and I mean, I suppose that you know the lesson is that there needs to be quite a substantial degree of cultural sensitivity and understanding of other societies, and I mean, perhaps that's in a sense one of the biggest challenges that the West faces. Let me focus on the West particularly. You know, I think we don't have vast arrays of people who speak Chinese, who've spent time in China, who have a sort of you know understanding based on actual living experience of what's going on in China today. You know, we tend to look far too much at the news headlines, forgive me, in this forum, but which, you know, inevitably talk about what Xi Jinping has said or the latest document coming out of the party central committee. But actually, China is much more diverse and much more complicated than that. And as Jing says, you know, Chinese consumers, they're going global, they're traveling, they're being educated overseas. You know, they're in my experience, young people often pretty open-minded, pretty liberal. And this is a big part of China that I think we need to pay much more attention to and to try and understand as we engage in an emerging China. Probably this is a good place to do it as well. You know, South China, innovation, Shenzhen, Hong Kong with its international sort of legacies, you know, the Greater Bay Area is a part of China moving forward into the world. You know.
Okay. Yeah.
So, you know, in terms of this, how to appeal to the Chinese consumer? The Chinese consumer is probably the most knowledgeable, savvy, astute, discerning consumer in the world. They're also very proud. So when companies from other countries seek to win over the hearts and wallets of the Chinese consumer, they really need to be attuned to Chinese sensitivities, right? To avoid some of the mistakes some companies have been making. But Chinese consumers are also changing very rapidly. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would always see busloads of Chinese people getting off, you know, on Champs-Élysées in Paris and rushing into the Louis Vuitton shop and buy everything in that shop. But that's now seen as uncool. You know, Chinese consumers are becoming much more individualistic. Sure. They want to go to places others haven't been to. Sure. They are not just buying a luxury handbag or a super yacht. They want to experience things. They want to share their experiences on their social network. So I think that nature of the Chinese consumer is changing very rapidly. Even within China, within the mass market, you know, if you're selling instant noodles from northern China to southern China, the tastes are very different. You have better change the products to not just what the Chinese consumer needs, but also to each and every individual customer in the north part, in the southern part. So the tastes vary a great deal.
Yeah, yeah. Maybe we can look at the poll from the audience. Let's see what everybody thought about the Chinese century. I saw it earlier. I saw it out of the corner of my eye earlier. It looked like more people voted for It's Already Begun. Can we show it on the back? Anyway,
John, I'm not sure you had an option.
There you go.
I'm not sure you had an option for it will never start.
That's. Do you want to make an argument for why it would never start?
I mean, that's not to kind of push back against the general thrust, which is that China is growing and becoming more influential. But you know, a Chinese century, if we take the American century as the model from you know, I think the 1940s, the phrase started. You know, it's the sort of dominant economy globally. You know, maybe we won't see that. Maybe we'll actually see a century where either, you know, we have a pessimistic scenario of fragmentation and competition and geopolitical rivalry, or if we want to be more optimistic, we have, you know, a world where we have multiple powers that can work together if they can find ways to do that, you know, to sort of further global governance on a more collective basis. But that may not be a Chinese century, but it might not be a bad century to be in.
I agree. Jean, what do you think of that poll? And I would say maybe it's because we're in Hong Kong. I think maybe the closer you are to China, the more you feel it. But what do you think of that poll, the results?
Well, I think it's not surprising, you know, given the audience here. But it's important to recognize what do we mean by the Chinese century. We talked about the Asian century earlier, right? A number of years ago. Now we're talking about this huge emerging power that is going to dominate everything in the world in terms of the size of GDP, contribution to global growth, the consumption market as a major demand driver for all kinds of goods and services, right? But also, if you think about China's influence on the world, right? In the past, China used to be a big capital importer. It used FDI to grow its economy. It imported a lot of foreign technology, products, know-how. But now China's become a larger and larger capital exporter. Right. Part of the Chinese exporting capital around the world, including the Belton Road initiative, is a way for China to exert more influence, right? And domestically, if you think about it, right, if China is to go to the next stage of its growth, it needs to develop technology. And the leadership knows this. So I would say in the coming several years, if China is indeed going to become a superpower, it is already a superpower, but in the technological sphere, China still has some ways to go. Sure. In areas such as AI, of course, there's competition between China and the US, but Chinese scientists are quickly catching up. Chinese companies are developing their own ecosystems. It's quite interesting to see that in the technological sphere between US and China, there's not much collaboration. Maybe there's some collaboration in academia, but in terms of commercial applications, they're separating. You have Tencent, Alibaba in China, you've got Amazon and Google in the US. I wonder whether the world could emerge into a situation where you have two internets, two payment systems, two of everything, right? Some countries will follow the US, maybe the Belton Road countries will follow China. So there's a great deal of competition between the two. And innovation, of course, is going to be a key driver for growth in China, but I don't think this is going to be a smooth path.
Right.
There will be bumps along the road. But I would agree with most of the audience that the Chinese century is already upon us.